Unit 31: The Growth of Indian Capitalism, the Capitalist Class, and the Freedom Struggle. The structure of this unit: 31.0 Objectives, 31.1 Introduction, 31.2 Growth of Indian Economy and the Indian Capitalist Class, 31.3 The Emergence of a Class Organization. The subsections included are Role in the Economic Sphere, Role in the Political Sphere. 31.4 Nature of Anti-imperialism, the Constitutional Path. 31.5 Congress and the Capitalists. 31.6 Capitalist View of the Congress. The subsections included are Approaching the Congress, Capitalist Strategy to Contain the Left. 31.7 Let us sum up. 31.8 Keywords. 31.0 Objectives. After reading this unit, you will get to know about the growth of the Indian capitalist class in the context of colonialism and the colonial economy, attitude of the Indian capitalists as a class towards colonialism, attitude of the Indian capitalists towards the mass movements and left, and relationship between the capitalist class and the Indian National Congress. Section 31.1 Introduction. The Indian national movement was in its initial stages during the second half of the 19th century, mainly confined to the educated middle classes. However, in course of time, it began to expand its social base, and gradually other classes and sections of society began to join it. The nature of the role played by various classes and social groups and the timing of their joining the national struggle varied. In this unit, we will discuss the role of the Indian capitalist class in the freedom struggle. The modern capitalist class began to emerge in India in the second half of the 19th century. Till about World War I, there were few Indian capitalists, and the size of their investments was also not substantial. Moreover, they were as yet largely dependent on the colonial government's support. At this stage of development, it was hardly possible for the Indian capitalists as a class to take an open confrontationist position. CONFRONTATIONIST. Confrontationist. To take an open confrontationist position with regard to the colonial state. The capitalists stayed away from the Swadeshi movement of 1905 to 1908. At the time of the non-cooperation movement 1920 to 1922, while many traders participated in the movement, several eminent capitalists like Purushottam Das Thakurdas actually opposed the movement. Subsequently, however, the capitalists' position changed. There were many Indian capitalists who extended their support to the freedom struggle. Section 31.2 Growth of Indian Economy and Indian Capitalist Class. The emerging political position of Indian capitalists was connected with the nature and extent of the growth of the Indian economy. The developments in the Indian economy during the colonial period, especially in the 20th century, were significantly different from the experience of most other colonial countries and largely explain the position of Indian capitalist class vis-a-vis imperialism. VIS-A-VIS vis-a-vis. Let us briefly outline these developments. Soon after the beginning of the 20th century, the Indian economy entered a process of rapid import substitution. During the two world wars, as also in the course of World Depression of the 1930s, the grip of imperialism over the Indian economy became comparatively weaker, and the process of growth of Indian industry, largely the indigenous manufacturers substituting foreign imports, gained a large impetus. Impetus. More importantly, the growth in indigenous industry that occurred in this period was derived largely from the resources of independent Indian capital. In other words, the Indian capitalists grew with an independent capital base and not as junior partners of foreign capital. Increase in indigenous industrial growth since World War I was reflected in a definite reversal of the typical colonial pattern of foreign trade, under which the colony imported manufactured goods and exported agricultural raw materials. Between 1914 and 1945, the proportion of manufactured goods in India's total imports declined considerably, while the proportion in total exports increased. Conversely, the proportion of raw materials in India's total exports declined and the proportion of capital goods as opposed to consumer goods in total imports increased. Also, the dependence of Indian economy on the colonial type of international trade began to show a decline while the growth in internal trade took some rapid strides. The hold of foreign capital, which in any case was not as large in India as in some other colonial countries and was not very significant in domestic industry, began to decline during this period. Foreign capital inflow into the Indian economy fell off after a spurt in the early 1920s. On the other hand, repayments of foreign debt and repatriation 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 of existing foreign investments, partially through the takeover of foreign companies by Indian capitalists, started increasing, especially since the 1930s. As a result, from about 1935, there was a new outflow of foreign capital from India. In fact, during the World War II, India ceased to be a debtor country. DEBTOR, debtor. On the contrary, by the end of the war, Britain owed India a whopping sterling balance equivalent to nearly Rs 1500 crores. This meant that India was not dependent on the London money market any longer, as it did not need foreign borrowing. During the post-World War I period, in the course of the processes discussed above, the Indian capitalist class was able to grow rapidly. It was able to do so through constant economic and political struggle and by taking full advantages of the crisis faced by British imperialism, especially during the two wars and the Great Depression. The Indian capitalists resorted to import substitution in areas such as cotton, textiles, and steel industry and slowly took over areas like banking, jute, foreign trade, coal, tea, etc., where European capital in India had traditionally dominated. Also, they initiated some steps which accounted for the bulk of few investments made since the 1920s in industries such as sugar, cement, paper, chemicals, iron, and steel. As a result, on the eve of independence, India Enterprise had already captured about 72% of the Indian market. In the financial sphere, too, massive advances were made by Indian capital. For example, while in 1914 Indian banks held about 30% of the total deposits, by 1947 their share had increased to over 80%. Indian companies grew rapidly in insurance business as well, capturing about 79% of life insurance and 55% of general insurance by 1945. The total assets of the top three Indian business houses in 1946 greatly surpassed the total assets of the top three non-Indian companies. However, this spectacular and independent growth of Indian capitalist class, quite unusual in a colonial situation, did not occur, as is often argued, as a result of a conscious policy of decolonization initiated by the colonial state. It occurred in spite of and in opposition to colonialism, either when imperialism was facing a crisis or as a result of waging a constant struggle against the colonial interests. The Indian capitalists did not see their interests as tied with colonialism. Moreover, the capitalist class on the whole was not tied up in a subservient position. Subservient, subservient position, either economically or politically, with pro imperialist feudal interests in the country. Another situation where a colonial capitalist class may move towards collaborating with imperialism is when it sees a threat to its existence from radical anti capitalist or left wing popular movements in the colony. Such situations did arise in certain colonial or semi colonial countries where the capitalist class sought to suppress the radical movement in alliance with imperialism. We can cite the example of China. In India also, the capitalists were concerned about the growth of the left. However, whenever the Indian capitalist class felt that the threat from the left was growing, it responded not by seeking help from imperialism but by attempting to strengthen by various means the right wing in the national movement. The following points then emerge from the above discussion. The Indian capitalist class grew independently and in opposition to imperialism and therefore did not see the long term class interests as being tied up with imperialism. The rapid and independent growth of Indian capitalists enabled them to feel strong enough to take anti imperialist position. The threat of popular left movements did not lead the capitalist class to collaborate or compromise with imperialism. The issue before the capitalist class was not whether to oppose imperialism or not, but that the path chosen to fight imperialism should not be such that it would threaten capitalism itself. Check your progress 1. Was the growth of the capitalist class a byproduct of colonialism? What was the attitude of the Indian capitalist class towards the threat of the left?
Subunit 31.3 The Emergence of a Class Organization. Narrated by Sushma. It was in the process of figuring out its attitude towards imperialism and the national movement that the capitalist class in India emerged as a political entity. Since the early 1920s, capitalists like G.D. Birla and Purushottam Das Thakur Das were making efforts to establish a national level organization of Indian commercial, financial, and industrial interests. The initial idea was to establish an Indian business organization which could effectively lobby with the colonial government, a role which relatively more organized non-Indian business interests were already performing. This effort led to the formation of the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, open bracket, capital letters FICCI, close bracket, in 1927. The FICCI soon acquired a large membership which increasingly became representative of Indian business interests from all over the country. Within a short period of its formation, it was recognized by the British authorities as well as the general Indian public as a body which represented the dominant opinion within the Indian capitalist class. Subsection 31.3.1 Role in the economic sphere. The capitalist leaders clearly stated that the goal of the FICCI was to become the quotes, national guardians of trade, commerce, and industry. Close quote. It was to perform in the economic sphere the function that is normally expected of nationalist organization. In pursuance of this goal, the Indian capitalists developed a comprehensive economic critique of imperialism in all its manifestations. For example, The critic exposed the imperialist exploitation that was going on through direct appropriation of surplus in the form of taxation, remittance of tribute, or home charges, in addition to the exploitation through trade, foreign investments, financial and currency manipulations, and so on. The leaders of the Indian National Congress, of eminence of Motilal Nehru and Gandhiji, often did not hesitate to seek the assistance of capitalists like Purushottam Das or J.D. Birla on complex economic matters which related to Indian interests vis-a-vis imperialism. Subsection 31.3.2 Role in the political sphere. The role of the FICCI was, however, not be limited to making an economic critique of imperialism and fighting for the economic demands of the capitalist in class, in particular, and of the nation as a whole in general. The leaders of the capitalist class clearly saw the necessity of effective intervention in politics. Purushottam Das Thakur Das, president of FICCI, declared at its second annual session in 1928, open quote, "We can no more separate our politics from our economics." Close quote. Investment in politics for the capitalists meant allying with the Indian national movement. As Purushottam Das said in the 1928 FICCI session, open quote, "Indian commerce and industry are associated with and are indeed an integral part of the national movement, growing with its growth and strengthening with its strength." A transformation could be seen in Purushottam Das, for he had earlier opposed the non-cooperation movement. Clearly, the capitalists realized that even their economic aims could be achieved only by fighting for a change in the existing political system of colonial domination. G.D. Birla expressed his understanding in 1930, "It is impossible in the present political condition of our country to convert the government to our views. The only solution lies in every Indian businessman strengthening the hands of those who are fighting for the freedom of our country." But at the same time, Birla was conscious enough to tell the British government that he had never financed the civil disobedience movement. Next section, check your progress 2. Question 1. What was the initial objective behind the formation of the FICCI? Question 2. What role did the FICCI play in the economic sphere? Subunit 31.4 Nature of Anti-imperialism, the constitutional path. The capitalist class was concerned as to what kind of national struggle was to be supported by them. The capitalists, while determining their attitude towards the British, were always in favor of not completely abandoning the constitutional path and the negotiating table. They supported constitutional forms of struggle and were not in favor of agitation and civil disobedience. There were several reasons for the capitalist class adopting this attitude. 1. Fears of a mass movement. First, capitalists feared that mass civil disobedience, especially if it was prolonged, could lead to the radicalization radicalisation of the masses, and instead of just putting pressure against imperialism, it could begin to threaten capitalism itself. As Lalji Naranji, a leader of the Indian Merchants Chamber, Bombay, clearly stated in 1930, in quotes, private property, end quote, itself could be threatened by a mass movement, and disregard for authority created by it could produce disastrous after effects for the government of Swaraj. Not wishing the anti-imperialist movement to turn anti-capitalist, the capitalists always tried to bring back the national movement to a phase of constitutional opposition. Another reason why the capitalists could not afford to support a prolonged and all-out opposition to the colonial government was that in their normal day-to-day business, they needed a minimum cooperation of the government. And as we all know that at this time it was the colonial government. This dependence on the existing government for immediate needs, combined with the fact that mass agitation disrupted normal business, led the capitalists to shy away from any kind of mass action, even under the aegis spelled AEGIS of the Indian National Congress. Number 2. Constitutional forms. The capitalists considered that a total or prolonged boycott of all constitutional avenues, such as councils and legislatures, or the negotiations like the Round Table Conference, was a open quote suicidal policy, close quote. They felt that if the nationalist forces completely abandoned these forums, then with the help of loyalist elements, the government could easily get such policies or measures passed in these forums which would seriously affect Indian economic development. This again was linked with their own interests. Thus, keeping this in mind, the capitalists not only supported but at times actually participated in the various forms offered by the colonial government. For example, some of them even joined the Viceroy's Executive Council. In fact, they wanted to extract to their benefit whatever reforms that were possibly within the system. In certain cases, the capitalists did not support participation in constitutional bodies unconditionally. G.D. Birla and Purushottam Das made it clear that they were to open quote participate on their own terms close quote with no compromise on fundamentals. It was on this ground, for example, that the proposals of constitutional reforms put forward by the Joint Parliamentary Committee in 1934 were rejected by the FICC as being reactionary, spelled REACTIONARY, reactionary. Moreover, the capitalists generally refused to negotiate with the British government on constitutional or economic questions without the participation of, or at least the approval of, the leading organizations of the national movement. In 1930, for example, the FICCI advised its members to boycott the Roundtable Conference, saying that, open quote, no conference convened for the purpose of discussing the problem of Indian constitutional advance can come to a solution unless such a conference is attended by Mahatma Gandhi as a free man or as at least his approval. Close quote. Thus, many leading capitalists boycotted the first Roundtable Conference but attended the second along with Gandhi. When the Congress was absent for the third Roundtable Conference, Purushottam Das attended in his individual capacity, but he made it clear that the conference could not settle the constitutional problems in Gandhi's absence. The capitalists had clearly realized that no progress could be made to safeguard their interests unless support of the Congress was secured. Ambalal Surabai, a prominent capitalist of Ahmedabad, summed up in this situation in 1929 when he said, open quote, minus the support of the Congress, the government will not listen to you. Close quote. Thus, the capitalists were in favor of a constitutional approach and methodology due to two reasons. A. They could check the left by strengthening the right wing. B. They could show it to the government that they were in no way a threat to the continuity of British rule. For example, Purushottam Das declared in December 1942 that, open quote, the various demands put forward by the commercial community did not and could not aim at the liquidation of the British Empire. Close quote. It was the faith in constitutionalism that G.D. Birla involved himself during 1935 to 1937 with Gandhi regarding the question of elections and forming of ministries. Number 3. Attitude to mass movements. However, at times they felt a mass movement necessary in order to extract crucial concessions for their class or the country. Here we can cite the comment made by G.D. Birla in January 1931 about the ongoing civil disobedience movement. He said, open quote, there could be no doubt that what we are being offered at present is entirely due to Gandhiji. If we are to achieve what we desire, the present movement should not be allowed to slacken, spelled SLACKEN. Close quote. Number 4. Dangers of a prolonged mass movement. Yet they would not like the mass movement to continue for long. They would attempt for a compromise that could lead to the withdrawal of the movement. Often they offered their services as intermediaries between the government and the Congress in the negotiations for peace. The best example for this was the negotiations before the Gandhi-Irwin Pact (PACT) in March 1931. But here, threat of the continuing or launching the mass movement again was used as bargaining point. As G.D. Birla put it in January 1931, the capitalists in their open quote anxiety for peace, close quote, were not to surrender or reduce their demands. They, he continued, should have two objects to view. One is that we should jump in at the most opportune time to try for a conciliation, and other is that we should not do anything which might weaken the hands of those bracket, that is the national movement, close bracket, through whose efforts we have arrived at this stage. In other words, through the capitalists argued for peace or conciliation, they did not do either at the cost of surrendering basic national demands or of weakening the national movement as a whole. The capitalists, even when they had various reservations about the continuance or launching of a mass civil disobedience movement, never supported the colonial government in repressing it. On the contrary, they repeatedly pressurized the government to stop repression, remove the ban on the Congress and the press, release political prisoners, and stop arbitrary rule through ordinance. There was no change in the attitude even when the national movement was at the pitch of its non constitutional mass phase. The fear of the mass movement becoming too radical, or the fact that it involved losses in day to day business, did not lead the capitalist class as a whole to either supporting the government in repressing it or even openly condemning or dissociating from it. Next section, check your progress 3. First number, the capitalists use the constitutional forums, colon, 1. In their individual capacity, 2. While negating the Congress, 3. By consciously keeping the support of the Congress in their mind, 4. None of the above. Second, the capitalist favored 1. Prolonged mass movements, 2. Their position of intermediaries between the Congress and the government in getting early reconciliations to stop prolonged mass movements. 3. Total absence of mass movements. 4. None of the above. Subunit 31.5 Congress and the Capitalists. You would like to know about the relationship between the Indian National Congress and the capitalists. Generally speaking, their relationship is analyzed from two viewpoints. Colon. 1. The Congress was deeply influenced by the capitalists who used it to serve their own class interest. This viewpoint is centered on the thesis that the capitalists, by using the fund at their disposal, pressurized the Congress into fighting for their own demands like bullet point, a lower rupee sterling ratio, second bullet point, tariff protection to Indian industries, and third bullet point, reservation of coastal traffic to Indian shipping, etc. Besides this, the capitalists influenced the political decisions of the Congress, like the withdrawal of the civil disobedience movement in 1931, selections of Congress candidates in elections, particularly in 1937, crushing the working class movement during late 1930s, financing the right wing, etc. A major reason for their support to Gandhi was their firm belief that, open quote, he alone could check a class war, close quote, in this country. And Gandhi, on the other hand, sided with the capitalists. Hence, Congress was a capitalistic organization by nature. The second point of view is based on the assumption that the Congress was not at all influenced by the capitalists, rather, it dictated its own terms. According to this viewpoint, 1. A program of economic nationalism which demands for protection, fiscal and monetary autonomy vis-a-vis imperialism did not benefit the capitalist class alone. These were national demands for independent economic development. Anyone who was anti-imperialist, whether a capitalist or not, had to fight for these demands. In fact, the socialists and communists in India also fought for these demands. Besides, the doctrine of economic nationalism was developed by the early nationalists in India several decades before the Indian capitalists organized themselves politically and began to fight for these demands. As a matter of fact, when these demands were first raised in the 19th century, the capitalist class had barely come into existence and it did not come out in support of them. Clearly, the Congress did not have to be bought, manipulated, or pressurized by the capitalists to put forward these demands. Secondly, the Congress' dependence on the funds from businessmen was not the determining factor as far as the policy decisions were concerned, nor was the financial dependence on capitalists so strong as to affect its policies. The overwhelming majority of congressmen maintained themselves on their own account and the day-to-day agitations were carried out with the voluntary hospitality and support of the common people and the funds raised through membership fees and small donations. Even during the constitutional phase, when the Congress went in for elections, its dependence on the capitalists for funds was not such as to make it dependent on them. In reply to a query from Lilithgow, spelled Linlithgow, the Viceroy, inverted comma, whether the Congress can for long continue an existence divorced from the Gandhian money bag, close quote, the Director of Intelligence Bureau submitted the following very significant report in 1934. Open quote, Congress has very important substitutes for regular finance. The appeal to patriotism saves a lot of cash expenditures, both for normal Congress activities and for election purposes. The money bags, open bracket, capitalists, close bracket, are less important than the Gandhian superstitions and the powerful influence of Congress ministers in office. With these influences to support them, local Congress organizations can command so much support from the public that they are in a position to fight elections without much money. Close quote. This is not to say that the Congress did not need or accept funds from the capitalists, especially during the constitutional phases. However, through these funds, the capitalist class was not in any basic way able to influence the policy and ideology of the Congress along lines which was not acceptable to it independently. The attitude of the Congress leaders, even those who were supposed to be close to the capitalists, is very revealing in this context. Gandhiji, as early as February 1922, while welcoming and even appealing for support from merchants and milli owners made it very clear that whether they do so or not, the country's march to freedom cannot be made to depend on any corporation or groups of men. This is a mass manifestation. The masses are moving rapidly towards deliverance, 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 and they must move whether with the aid of the organized capital or without. This must therefore be a movement independent of capital and yet not antagonistic to it. Antagonistic, antagonistic to it. Only if capital came to the aid of the masses, it would redound to the credit of the capitalist, spelled redound, to the credit of the capitalist, and as on the advent of the happy day. Similarly, Motilal Nehru, who in the Swarajist phase SWARIJIST phase was in close contact with Bombay and Ahmedabad capitalists and accepted significant sums of money from them for political work, had no hesitation in severely castigating them in 1928 when he felt that they were trying to retreat from their erstwhile commitments, ERSTWHILE commitments. He said, the Congress should welcome this change in the attitude of the mill owners. An alliance between the Congress and the capitalists who are bent on profiting by the sufferings of the nation is an impossible one. The more suitable field of work for the Congress is among the workers and not the owners of the mills. But I was misled by the patriotic talk of some of my personal friends among the mill owners. Mahatma Ji never believed in an alliance with the latter, LATTER, and I have now told him that he was right and I was wrong. The message was clear. The capitalists had to behave if the Congress was to work with them. Whether they did so or not, the Congress would go ahead with its work, relying on the support of their classes. But this did not mean that the Congress did not want their financial support. On many occasions, it took donations. For example, Dalmia contributed substantially for election fund in 1937 and the constructive program was always financed by Birla. Subsection 31.6 Capitalist view of the Congress. How did the Indian capitalists view the Indian National Congress? In fact, the Congress was never perceived by them as their own class party. J.K. Mehta of the Indian Merchants Chamber put it as a party, open quotes, with room in it for all shades of political opinion and economic views, close quote. But at the same time, the capitalists tried to ensure that the national movement did not get radicalized, that is, come under the influence of socialists or communists. With this perspective, they strengthened the right wing in the Congress. For example, G.D. Birla wrote to Purushottam Das, open bracket, 3rd August 1934, close bracket, colon. Vallabhbhai, Rajaji and Rajendra Babu are all fighting communism and socialism. It is therefore necessary that some of us who represent the healthy capitalism should help Gandhi as far as possible and work with a common object. In fact, Birla and Thakur Das had earlier opposed the suggestion of Dorabji Tata for forming a political party of the capitalists. This was because they felt that the Congress itself could take care of their interest provided the right wing dominated in the Congress. The Gandhian principle of trusteeship open bracket unit 13 close bracket suited them well, for it discouraged anti-capitalist struggle. Subsection 31.6.1 Approaching the Congress. Interestingly, the capitalists themselves showed remarkable maturity in never seeing the Congress as their class party or even as a party amenable only to their influence. They fully recognized that the Congress was a multi-class popular movement, open quote, with room in it, close quote, as J.K. Mehta of the Indian Merchants Chamber put it, open quote, for all shades of political opinion and economic views, close quote. Which shade or which class perspective would exercise greater weight within the Congress remained an open question and was partially linked to the political maturity and far-sightedness of each class. Subsection 31.6.2 Capitalist strategy to contain the left. It is with this understanding that the capitalists molded their politics to try to ensure that the national movement did not get too radicalized. That is, it did not come under the dominating influence of the socialists or communists. However, as pointed out earlier, the capitalists did not respond to the growing threat of the left in India by allying themselves with imperialism. For example, in 1928, they refused to support the colonial government in passing the Public Safety Bill, which was intended to contain the communists, on the ground that such a bill would result in an attack on the national movement. The fact that the capitalists did not abandon the side of nationalism even when threatened by the left tendency within the national movement went a long way in maintaining the influence of the capitalist perspective within the movement. Instead of abandoning the side of nationalism, the capitalists evolved a complex strategy to combat the left in the nationalist stream. As a part of their strategy, they gave support to the right wing of the national movement and did extensive political and ideological propaganda arguing for rapid economic growth, equitable distribution, partial nationalization, land reforms, and schemes for workers' welfare. By formulating what FICCI President G. L. Mehta called, quote, a consistent program of reforms in bracket as the close bracket most effective remedy against social upheavals, spelled UPHEAVALS, close quote. They sought to combat the influence of the left on the national movement. It needs to be reiterated, however, that the capitalists attempt to contain the national movement within BOURGEOIS limits did not involve any compromise with imperialism. They remained anti-imperialist, though their goal was to evolve or support a strategy of overthrowing imperialism, which would simultaneously ensure the maintenance of the capitalist system. Next section, check your progress 4. 1. It may be said that 1. The capitalists were not financing the Congress in any way. 2. The capitalists were completely financing the Congress. 3. The capitalists were financing the Congress, but the extent to which this determined the Congress's political decision is a matter of controversy. 4. None of the above. Number 2. One of the most effective strategies the capitalists evolved to contain the left in the national movement was to 1. Strengthen the ultra-left, 2. Dissociate themselves from the Congress mainstream, 3. Remain within the Congress and strengthen the right wing, 4. None of the above. Subunit 31.7. Let us sum up. In this unit, you got to know bullet point 1 about the emergence of Indian capitalism in the concrete conditions of the space created by declining hold of foreign capital, import, substitution forced by war, and changes in foreign trade. This took place because of an internal crisis in imperialism weakened by the World War and the 1930s depression. Bullet point about how even then the Indian capitalists had to struggle against colonial policies to establish themselves. Bullet point about how the organization of the Indian capitalist as a class under the Federation of Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry open bracket FICCI close bracket help to define in a concrete manner how economically and politically imperialism was affecting its growth. Bullet point. It was the result of this clear-cut critique of colonialism that decided the Indian capitalist strategy in the national movement. Bullet point. That this strategy was marked by 1. A realization of the danger and the necessity of the mass movements to their interest. 2. A need to counter the potential of the left, and 3. A need to constantly orient the multi-class platform that the Congress was towards its class interests. Subsection 31.8 Keywords Import substitution an economic policy which asks for manufacturing those goods which were previously brought from abroad to be produced within the country itself. This policy normally helps the growth of national indigenous industries. Compradors COMPRADORS those capitalists whose enterprise is completely subordinate to foreign capital. Next, feudal interest FEUDAL feudal interest interest whose dominant means of subsistence is control over land and its tillers. Next, relative autonomy of the national movement, a term which indicates that the national movement was not linked to any dominant class interest, though it contained within it interests and hopes of all classes. Subunit 31.9 Answers to check your progress exercises. Check your progress 1. 1. See subsection 31.2.5. Your answer should cover 1. The nature of Indian capitalist opposition to colonialism, and 2. The weakening of British imperialism. 2. Subsection 31.2.7. Your answer should include 1. The capitalist attitude towards the growth of left, and 2. The strength of the left. Check your progress 2. 1. See section 31.3, the first para. Your answer should include the efforts of Indian business to build a national organization to lobby for their interest. 2. See subsection 31.3.1. Your answer should include 1. Its role of a national guardian of trade and industry. 2. Its role in developing a critique of imperialism. Check your progress 3. First question, answer is 3. Second question, answer is 2. Check your progress 4. First question, answer is 3. Second question, answer is 3. End of the section.